Hello and welcome to this ESEP webinar, A Perspective from the Inside in this case being Capitol Hill. My name is Erin Heath and I'm Associate Director of Government Relations at the American Association for the Advancement of Science and co-chair of the ESEP Coalition. I'm very pleased to introduce two guests today, both of whom work on Capitol Hill. We have Dahlia Sokolov, who is the Democratic Staff Director of the Subcommittee on Research and Technology and the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And we have Fern Gibbons, Policy Director for Oceans and Surface Transportation and the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Before we get into our discussion, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about ESEP, which stands for Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy. This coalition was formed in 2013 with the goal of empowering scientists and engineers to engage in policy at all levels of government. You can find all sorts of resources and events on the ESEP website, which is science-engage.org. Now I'd like to turn to our guests. First, I'd like each of you to talk about your own journeys from science to science policy and what that transition has been like for you. And I'll start with you, Fern.
Sure. Do you want me to go to my academic? Okay. So I went to undergraduate at the University of Chicago, and I concentrated in biology and the geophysical sciences. And then went to grad school where I studied paleoceanography at the joint program between MIT and Woodsville Oceanographic Institute. And there is not much policy in my academic background at all. In fact, I never took a political science class, which in retrospect probably would have been handy, but that's fine. And so I was wrapping up my PhD, and I think I was in kind of the life phase that an awful lot of people end up at when they're wrapping up their PhD, in that I was somewhat burned out. And I thought I'd like to do something else. And a friend of mine was just starting a policy fellowship, and it sounded really appealing, and honestly, part of the thing that was appealing was it was a relatively short application, and I, again, was really sick of writing. So I decided to apply for the Canal Spring Policy Fellowship, which is a NOAA-hosted program. It sent me to Capitol Hill for a year. I worked on the Commerce Committee, Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and mostly on the Oceans, Atmosphere, Fisheries, and Coast Guard Subcommittee. It's a year-long policy fellowship. It was a great experience. I would have been happy to stay. They didn't have an opening for me to stay, so I ended up unemployed for about 3 months, which I only mentioned to if anyone else is currently in that very stressful in-between stage. There is usually an end, so hang in there. And then I went to the Nature Conservancy for about a year. A position opened back up on the Commerce Committee, and I returned to do mainly oceans work, but at this point I oversee 2 subcommittees, the Oceans, Atmosphere, Fisheries, and Coast Guard, as well as Surface Transportation and Merchant Marine Subcommittee, which does trains, certain parts of trucks, as well as the Merchant Marine. So it's been really great, and it seems like maybe not the most natural transition, but there's an awful lot of things that you learn in academics that are extremely useful on Capitol Hill. I'd say particularly the kind of extended negotiations you go through when writing a paper and putting it through the peer review process. It turns out that there's a lot of aspects of negotiating legislation that are very, very similar. You write what you think is a very good product, and you get a lot of feedback, which ranges from positive to very hostile, and you have to kind of navigate that feedback and improve your product until there's enough consensus that it can move forward. And, you know, that kind of being able to take constructive criticism, incorporate that criticism, and represent your product in a way that actually makes people happier, you know, I mean, that's bread and butter to people who work on papers, and very similar, actually, to when you work on legislation. So there's, as diverse as science and policy are, I feel like there's a tremendous number of skills that scientists have that are immensely valuable in the policy realm. So, wrap it up there.
Thanks. Dahlia, how about you?
Sure. Well, I majored in physics and worked for a year and decided, as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up, I decided to go to graduate school in bioengineering, applying the undergraduate in physics a little bit more to, in this case, a biomedical context. And I had every intention of going on and being a professor from the outset, from the time I entered graduate school. And somewhere along the way, I started to question whether that was the right path for me, even though I really enjoyed research. I love science. I had a very positive experience. But I also really loved communicating science, and I really loved thinking about broader issues than what the sort of narrow research areas we typically carve out for ourselves in the research arena. And it just so happened when I was in my third or fourth year that one of my classmates, I was in Seattle, Washington, at the University of Washington, one of my classmates came to this Washington for a 3-month policy internship at the National Academy called the Christine Muir Science Technology Policy Fellowship, and he went back to Seattle raving about it. I started talking to my advisor about it, and I had a really supportive advisor. And the following year, actually, I was able to apply, and I was successful and spend 3 months in D.C., and I got what they call the gentleman fever. I got the bug. So I did go back, very willingly to finish my PhD. Like I said, it was a positive experience for me overall. But then I moved back to Washington, D.C., and I actually did a 2-year postdoc at NIH as I was trying to kind of situate myself and figure out how to get my foot in that policy door. And I got my foot in through the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program. That was way back in 2004, and I actually landed during my fellowship with the House Science Committee. Interestingly, on the Republican side at the time, I would say a different kind of Republican than is sort of in the majority of the party today, and working on the Energy Subcommittee on nuclear issues, which I had no background on specifically, but certainly the physics and broad engineering background really helped me both get up to speed quickly on the science technology and be able to translate it for the members. And that was all very exciting, and I was there during an exciting time. And when my fellowship was coming to an end and the staff position opened up, unlike Fern, I was lucky I was in the right place at the right time. There was a position as my fellowship was ending, and they hired me. And I served out there so that chairman's term, Sherry Bowler at the time, through 2006. And then I got lucky again, and I got hired onto the Democratic staff when the Democrats took control of the House in January 2007, and moved to a different subcommittee, the Research Subcommittee, and took on basic academic research issues and STEM education. And over the years, I moved up, became staff director of the subcommittee, and then we had 2 subcommittees merge, and so now it's the Research and Technology Subcommittee, and I do issues with NIST, standards and technology, a law on technology transfer, partnerships with industry on that end of things, and I continue to do the basic academic research policy issues and STEM education broadly. In the minority party now, that's a different kind of experience. I've been majority, minority, Republican, and Democrat. And after the transition, it was a while ago, 13 years ago now. But I do remember it being a steep learning curve. At the same time, as Fern indicated, there are skills we developed through graduate school. I remember being able to apply the sort of analytical approach to the issues, the patience, of course. But there's also a lot of new skills we develop over time. And that's also, an exciting part of learning on the job. And there's a lot of frustrations in the job, but a lot of rewards to it as well.
Excellent. So I want to encourage all of you that are watching live, you can submit questions live. Just type it into the question box. This is a question that we received on our online discussion portal, Trellis. And it has to do more with your committee work, and you touched on this a little bit. How do you break down the work that your committees and subcommittees are doing?
So, yeah, a lot of my boss is from South Dakota, and a lot of the issues we work on don't directly relate to his personal priorities. For example, fisheries. Not many marine fisheries in South Dakota. Well, none. But his view is that our job is to be of service to all our members. So And so we do a lot of the our bread and butter work is taking other folks' priorities and helping to make them into a reality. And so we pull together hearings. If someone comes with an idea for a bill, it's often not something that could potentially pass yet, and so our job is to help take kind of those ideas and make them mature policy products, whether it be a hearing or legislation. I think and maybe there's definitely a difference between the House and Senate in terms of the committee versus personal office. In the Senate, the individual senators are relatively powerful compared to committee staff, and so we, I think, operate within many more bounds, potentially sometimes than the House committee, where the committee staff are very influential in really helping to shape members' priorities. And I don't know if you agree or disagree.
we joke about Senate staff, so maybe with different perspectives.
Maybe we'll disagree, and I'll get into trouble here. But you know, any single senator can really hang up our legislation, so we need to navigate that very carefully. Whereas I feel like on the House side, they have a more corralling job, maybe.
So, okay, so maybe I'm going to agree and disagree at the same time, which is on committee. As committee staff, yes, you're probably operating under more constraints than we are in the House. But then because any individual senator can hang something up, that means the personal office staff in the Senate have a tremendous amount of power to influence their senator to stop something or to derail, to put their finger on something in whatever direction. So on the House committee staff, my experience, I've had 3 different bosses. Chairman Bollert was my first, Chairman Bart Gordon my second, and my current boss is the ranking member of the committee, Eddie Bernice Johnson. My experience through all those years and the 3 bosses is that while we are always paying attention to the parochial interests of our boss to make sure we're not crossing wires, we are really there as committee staff not just to serve all the members, but to serve the nation. What's in the best interest of the nation and thinking about the development of policy, not what's in the best interest of a particular state or district. That's our job. We are divided on the Science Committee in particular. We're divided into 5 subcommittees. Staff tend to be, well, we have 1 boss, and that's, in my case on the Democratic side, the ranking member of the full committee. Most of the policy staff are assigned to one of the 5 subcommittees. So mine's research and tax. So I also then have to work closely with the subcommittee ranking member, Dan Lipinski from Illinois, to make sure, I can help him advance his priorities in science and technology. And sometimes, there can be a conflict occasionally between a subcommittee chair and full committee chair, subcommittee ranking and full committee ranking. And the full committee leadership prevails. Staff has to negotiate that a little bit sometimes. Most of the time, though, our membership tends to, on our side, we all tend to be on the same page, and that's helpful. I have some hearings that happen at the subcommittee. So the subcommittees, we have 5 subcommittees. We have a fairly well-defined portfolio for each subcommittee, but a lot of issues end up being cross-cutting as well. So I work very closely with my colleagues on other subcommittees. I do some hearings and legislation really strictly within the confines of my subcommittee. Others collaborate actively with my colleagues on other subcommittees for more cross-cutting issues. Sometimes I staff hearings at the full committee if there is a hearing is elevated to the full committee level. So there's lots of opportunities to work with lots of different members on lots of different issues and to be part of the team really on committee, which is great.
I wanted to dig a little bit more into, you were talking about the differences, some of the differences between the Senate and the House. I wanted to dig into that more, and I'll start with you, Dahlia. What is the best thing about working on the House side, and what is perhaps the most challenging thing?
Well, things move in the House, right? We have hearings, legislation moves, and so we get to see the entire process. Excuse me. We get to see the entire process through from beginning to end. Now, we may hate the outcome, especially being in the minority party. And that's the worst thing about, I guess, being in the House is it is absolutely a majority-run institution. And if the majority party, the Republican Party in this case, comes up that we want to work with you and get to a bipartisan outcome, that's wonderful. And I can point to many successes of bipartisan bills, small and big, both from when I was in the majority and starting that conversation and sitting where I am in the minority now. But there's many other cases, if you follow the news, in which there's not even, they barely pretend to engage in bipartisanship, and so we're playing defense. That can be fun too, because then you're kind of throwing bombs, and writing those speeches for our members can be kind of fun. Not in the best interest of the nation. I will be clear about that. But there are different skills to the job and really a whole, and it can vary so much day to day depending on the environment and the issue you're working on and the particular members involved. And, so I think that's the best and the worst of the house.
And I'll turn the same question to you. Best and most challenging things about working.
I think, on some level it is the same thing in that we are a much more consensus-driven body, and so the vast majority of legislation I work on passes via unanimous consent, which is, in the news you hear about you need 60 votes for this, occasionally we need 50 votes for other things, but unanimous consent means we need nobody to object. And so it's an expedited way we can pass bills, but they need to be kind of fully greased. There can't be anything controversial, or if there is, it involves a lot of discussions to get to a good place on that. So that can be an immensely rewarding process because you end up having to talk to and negotiate and be creative and reach good solutions. It can be frustrating in that it really does just take a single senator to derail something that you've been working on for a while, and it can be then difficult to overcome if one person feels extremely strongly, sometimes that's all it takes to kill what is otherwise really good policy. And so that aspect is frustrating, but the needing to build consensus, the needing to be creative and talk to people and build those relationships is, simultaneously kind of the most satisfying part of my job.
Excellent. I'd like to turn to another question from Charlotte, which I think is a really key question for our audience. Which is, what's your advice for a scientist or engineer who's interested in connecting with a committee or subcommittee? Who should they reach out to? And how can they build relationships and create a dialogue with committee members and committee staff? Fern, what do you think?
We tend to have an open door policy. So if you email, if you even just go online, so first it helps to figure out which is the appropriate committee to be contacting for your issues. And most committees have a description on the website of the issues they work on. And so that's a good way to figure it out. Or honestly, if you call our frontline committee office and say, I'm interested in XYZ, who do I talk to? And it's not our jurisdiction, they'll tell you where to go. Or if it is our jurisdiction, they'll connect you to the right person and you can set up a meeting like that. And so it's at least our office's view that anyone with a concern should feel free to come talk to us, or if they're an expert, if they say they're an expert on tsunamis and they say, I see you're working on a piece of tsunami legislation, I'd like to talk to you about that. That's great. You should also folks should always feel welcome to do that exact same thing with their home state senators or representatives. And, we're always happy to talk because the more we know, the better our legislation is.
So I would agree, but also qualify that. In theory, not in theory, in practice, we also have an open door policy. However, I strongly encourage scientists and engineers to engage either through the universities, and universities all either have federal affairs offices or people in DC they work through, or both, or through their scientific societies. And I say that because, number one, it's good for you to get a sort of broad sense of the context and some of the politics before you walk into a congressional office. And number two, it's good for us that we know you're coming in with some of that context. I think it's better use of my time, better use of your time as a scientist to go through those established avenues to reach out to us. So having said that, yes, absolutely open door, and I echo what Fern says on that point.
No, and that a good thing to add is I think also the societies will help you craft your message so it's conveyed more effectively. So it really is a win-win. So that's a good point.
Well, thanks for that plug for Scientific Society. Now, a follow-up question just came in. How do you engage if you're not in Washington, D.C.? What's the best way to do that? Dahlia?
I think there's probably lots of opportunities to engage at the local level through local chapters of your scientific society and have influence through the society in terms of policy positions, white papers, and so on in the society's engagement in Washington. Likewise, trying to influence, as I said, your university probably has somebody who's also engaging in Washington and having some influence on their thinking and the ways in which they sell and present, the research going on at your institution. So I lost my train of thought. I'll leave it at that.
And I would add on that working through your university, our bosses are all back home on the weekends and during recess. And so, a great way, if you're not in D.C. to influence policy, is to have your senator or your representative come visit your university and learn about some of the research. Now, that can be hard to arrange, but, that is one of the best ways, because then you just have the direct voice. And I think all our bosses love to see what's going on in either their states or their districts. So,
and staff, too. We don't travel that much. Most of us don't travel that much if we're not appropriators. But when we do get a chance to get out and kick the tires, so to speak, and see the fruits of federal investments, both in terms of what's going on, sort of broad-based in research labs at some of the very large user facilities that we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars over time, that is very useful for us. We're bringing that knowledge back to our members as well to help inform their thinking. So, yes, if you can get the member, absolutely, I'll second that. But if you can get staff, too, that's helpful.
Now, you both mentioned, I want to turn back to your transition to policy, and I have a few questions along those lines. You both found policy fellowship to be really integral to your career path. So what are some options for those who either don't want to do a fellowship route or can't for some reason, aren't eligible? What's your advice in terms of transitioning to a career in science policy?
That's a great question, and I would say it's hard because most of the people looking to hire are looking for someone with some experience. If you're extremely early in your career, obviously doing internships is a great way, but that, I think you reach a certain life stage where you're really no longer interested in doing an internship. But I think probably another potential avenue would just be to see what in-house, either your university or professional society, what in-house policy work they are doing, and at least start learning about it through that and becoming an expert and trying to be creative in how you can apply your own skills in the policy realm. You don't need to come into a policy job with a ton of expertise. So even if it was, I collaborated with my university policy person on this paper, or I helped coordinate this, in-house conference. Those things can add up, but it's just much more difficult to get, I think, a policy job without something like a fellowship.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's harder to get in that door. The fellowship really does make that path so much smoother. Having said that, I know people who finish their fellowship program and spend months looking for a job. The job market can be difficult no matter what. But I also know people with master's, PhDs who just went knocking on the doors or were in the right place at the right time and got hired without any fellowship. I think it's a lot of pounding the pavement, I guess, as they say, and being willing to start with maybe something that's less than ideal just to get your foot in the door.
I love this question. What was the biggest surprise And you came to Capitol Hill. Biggest surprise, Dahlia?
I don't know. Can you start with Fern? I gotta think about that.
I would say there's two things that surprised me, and this is gonna, I don't know, maybe this will sound weird, but Capitol Hill is largely run by really ordinary people who have the same kind of ordinary concerns that everybody else has. And so when I would watch news and people would be like, oh, well, we're anticipating folks to get to a deal because the holidays are coming up. And my reaction is always like, well, they can work through the holidays and get to a deal. And then you're there and you realize that someone is trying to get home to see their parents or to see someone they haven't seen in a year. And people do not stop being real people just because they're on Capitol Hill. And so that, I don't know why that was surprising to me, but it was. And the other thing that's so surprising is how quickly, again, all the senators are also individual people, and they make individual decisions that then really can have a trickle-down effect and impact a number of people's jobs. So when I was a fellow, you know, the woman I was nominally assigned to decided not to rerun. Someone else decided to resign from the Senate. And it set off this whole chain of events of people who had been kind of lining up their careers were all of a sudden, you know, starting to think about what else they should do. And it's amazing how it really is, again, Capitol Hill is just run by ordinary people.
So I'm not going to necessarily characterize this as surprise number one. I'm racking my brain. It was a while ago. But number two, I lived in D.C. for a couple of years even before I started my fellowship, and I have family here, and so things were not, it wasn't as radical a transition as it was for me as it is for some scientists coming into Washington. But I want to say one thing I was impressed with that I always want to remind people is, in addition to staff and members of Congress, senators being normal people, there are a lot of very smart, committed public servants trying to do the right thing, and we have disagreements, and that's natural. There's also some people I might put in a different category, but overall you should have confidence that there really are a lot of good, smart, dedicated public servants working here, not just on the Hill, but across the government, really trying to do the right thing.
Do you have any favorite accomplishments in your policy career so far? Anything you're particularly proud of? What do you want to brag about now? Why don't you start, Dahlia?
So these are two very different ones, and I'll try to be brief, but they're ones I like to talk about. And so I told you I had the nuclear energy portfolio when I started, and at the time George W. Bush was president, and he was proposing a major scale-up of our investments in nuclear reprocessing and recycling, and imagining a whole new closed nuclear fuel cycle future. And I had, I was on the Republican side, as I mentioned, and I had as my subcommittee chair a congresswoman from Illinois who had Argonne National Lab in her district. Illinois is 50% nuclear. She was a big champion of nuclear energy, and of course, certainly a big champion of the research going on at Argonne Lab. And me personally, I came in as kind of agnostic on nuclear energy, concerned about climate change and all options, having all options on the table, and being supportive for that reason. But as I dug into this proposal from the administration and started to pick apart the science and realized that it was this kind of cartoonish vision for which we were not anywhere near that being there in terms of the science technology, I was able to slowly help turn my subcommittee chair into one of the biggest skeptics of this proposal, while she remained strongly pro-nuclear without question, but really skeptical about the specifics of this proposal. And she was a Republican, as a Republican administration, but our committee became one of the most important committees for having public discussions about what was this really, what was behind the curtain, so to speak, of this proposal. So that for me was really felt like something I was very proud of. And then just I won't go into specifics, but some legislation I've been involved in. If you're familiar with the broader impact criterion at the National Science Foundation for all their research grants, been involved in trying to put some meat on the bones of that, and I've had a lot of positive feedback and some positive developments as a result of that. and some other legislation. Public access is another one, to the results of, and AAAF has their own view on that, but results of federally funded research. Issues I've worked on over the years, I feel like I've helped move the needle forward with productive discussion, sometimes pulling together parties on different sides, very different sides, and use the forum we have on the committee in Congress to pull those parties together and try to move the discussion forward. And so over 13 years, maybe it feels like a few things, but they were good things that I'm proud of.
Excellent. Fern, how about you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is we worked on this this weather bill that our priorities were improving subseasonal to seasonal forecasts, incorporating some more of the social science into how risk communication was done, and really helping to pull the National Weather Service forward in terms of leveraging the improvement in technology that we've seen in weather forecasting to free up some of the personnel resources to better do kind of that forecast communication with local stakeholders, which, you know, in our opinion is what really then helps to actually stabilize. And it was a really gratifying process in part, especially with the National Weather Service aspect, in that, you know, we started working on the bill, we were talking to the administration, they kind of launched a parallel process. And at the end of the day, you know, I think we started out in a very different place in the administration, but our bill kind of evolved to where their internal process was going. And I think because, and it took a long time, well, I guess not that long, but it felt like a long time. And I think at the end of the day, the National Weather Service really is like embracing technology, providing better service, and they were able to shape the legislation to make it a way that they could then actually easily implement. So we didn't come up with some pie in the sky idea at the end. It was something that they could actually do. And so it was really satisfying. It took a really long time, and it was, I would say, at least a half dozen times where, for a variety of reasons, I thought we were like done and we should give up. But we did it, so it was great. And then the other thing that I'm really proud of is our office got a whistleblower complaint about a sexual harassment case on a NOAA vessel, and we dug into that, and it turned out NOAA didn't even have a policy at the time on how to deal with sexual harassment, and their research vessels are this, you know, great experience where you have NOAA crew, you have scientists, you have students, you have volunteers, you have teachers. So that's potentially fantastic, but without any like recourse for, okay, I'm a student and I have a problem, who do I talk to? Problems can escalate really quickly, and so we put together some legislation, at least requiring NOAA to establish a policy and a hotline, and, you know, I think there's been some really positive progress made in that realm.
Thanks. We had a couple of questions come in that are career-related questions specific to congressional committees. And the first one is, how are congressional science policy individuals hired? Are they hired by committees, individual members, or in other ways?
Oh, I mean, A and B. We hire on committee. You know, we try to recruit fellows, and it's a way for us to get to know them, and them to get to know us, and to develop some of the skills. And so I was hired on after fellowship, but some colleagues over time were. So we also hire people, from out of personal offices who have experience on the Hill and personal office, but not committee, out of the agencies. Some people with science backgrounds, frankly, and other people who don't, and who just learn on the job. I have excellent colleagues who we hired almost out of their bachelor's degree in whatever, but it wasn't a science field, and are really phenomenal members of the staff. Personal offices, likewise. I've never hired from a personal office, but there's often a parochial interest. Are you from the district? Or are you somehow connected? Maybe you went to school there. You're somehow connected to the district. But I know plenty of staff also working for members where they have no direct connection to the district, but they have some expertise and experience the member wanted on staff.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, except in our personal office, the entry-level positions are almost always by folks from the home state, and they're almost always by folks who've done an internship in the office, just much like the fellowship, the office gets to know what they're like. But there is much more flexibility at the non-entry level, and so there's a variety of ways that people can get hired in.
What's the typical turnover rate for congressional committee staff? What's the average tenure?
That's a really good question. I think it varies really widely. Capitol Hill is a relatively high turnover place, but there's certainly more stability in the committee staff, but it ranges from, a year to 30 years, and there's a lot of reasons for that variation. Some people decide they get a better offer and they leave, or sometimes when the chair or ranking member changes, there are some people who clean house, and then you need to find another job. When the parties split, the budget is, when you're in the majority, you have a larger budget, so there's some downsizing that often happens if you're suddenly find yourself in the minority. And so I would say, it's hard to pinpoint why some people have stayed so long and others haven't, but certainly I think the folks who have been there 30 years or so, it's a combination of they love their work, but they've also gotten somewhat lucky with various turnovers, or they're exceptionally skilled at handling those turnovers well.
Yeah, I've been there 13 years, and I think I'm second longest serving on my committee. My chief of staff has been there probably going on 30 years. And then just a few folks have been there, 10, 11 years. But I would say in all my time, I don't think any of my colleagues have served, unless it's a one-year fellowship program and we didn't have a staff position for them, I don't think any of my colleagues have served for less than 3 or 4 years before moving on. And from what I remember hearing, the turnover rate in house personal offices, the average is 18 months. So I don't know what the average is for a committee, but we're definitely longer lived on committee. It's considered a professional position and not just a sort of transition point or stopping point on the way to law school or something, or K Street or something else.
This next one that has come in has to do with policy briefs, and I think this refers to the one-pagers that are developed externally. Do you have any recommendations on what makes a good policy brief, how to improve them, and do you have a particular format that you really like, whether it be print or digital or something else? Dahlia.
I guess I tend to be a paper person, but if you send me something electronically, I won't, that I will definitely look at it. I don't have a particular format. It's really, are you putting together a coherent memo, whether it's 1 page or 1.5 pages? We kind of get fixated on this nation of 1 page, and I don't mean to say let that flip to 5 pages. But sometimes people then give us memos that are, I love this when I'm on the selection committee for the fellowship program, and we go through this process of writing memos, and they give me a 10-point font or even a 9-point font, 1-page memo. Are you making a coherent argument? Are you acknowledging? Did you briefly discuss what the context for what your policy position is? It varies so much, though. I don't know how to give you one answer to that question. It's a good question, and frankly, it's a skill that we learn on the job. I have to write those kinds of memos all the time for my members, and that is a skill we develop on the job, and it's not a skill that you can translate directly from writing research papers, as I learned at my first chief of staff. Because I think I had pretty strong writing skills. My first chief of staff, he'd rip up my memos. He was perfectionist, mind you, but he would rip up my memos, he'd rip up my statements that I wrote, for committee and floor, the speeches. He'd rip up my suggested questions for members for hearings, and so I had to learn from scratch how to write those types of forms of communication for the job I have now. And so I don't have one good answer of how do you do that now.
The only thing I have to add is sometimes it's helpful to pitch your memo or pitch your speech to a family member who is not an expert, because likely you have some educated family member who doesn't know what you're talking about. And so they're a pretty good gauge for the average Hill staffer. Like, the average Hill staffer is not going to be an expert in your topic. So practice on your friends and family, and I think that can help refine your skills so that it's a concise but logical argument, and they have enough background but not too much background, and yeah, because it's a skill, and it's just a lot of practice.
Good advice. That's great advice.
We have time for 2 more questions. Another skill that you have to have is the ability to juggle, right? You have so many issues that you're dealing with at any given time. You have information flowing towards you. So what are your strategies for dealing with all of this, for juggling, and do you feel like your scientific background will help you develop the skills?
That's a good question. I think that's probably something that I did not get a lot of great prep for in the scientific realm. I think what's been most useful to me, and this is something you learn on the job, is just the kind of the gut intuition of, we have like 8 bills on the market. Your gut as to which ones are most likely to become public law and which ones are less likely to become public law, and you kind of have to then just prioritize based on the ones that you think are most likely to move. Let's focus most of our efforts on those. We can potentially still mark up the others, acknowledging they're not perfect products. This strategy can obviously backfire sometimes when someone says, you signed off on this. The guy, yeah, I probably should have made a few changes on that, but, you know, it's just this gut check of what actually will move and, you know, what can get less attention, because you don't have enough time to devote just full in-depth attention to every single assignment you have.
Yeah, this is one of those weeks in particular. I've been jumping around between among radically different topics, from sexual assault, since that was brought up earlier, to quantum technology, to agricultural biotechnology, to cybersecurity, and I'm STEM education, and I know I'm missing a few things, and that's just in the last 3 days. We have to accept that we're not going to become expert in everything. This is a very different realm when we were in the research world, and we were expected to be an expert in whatever field that we were pursuing. We cannot be an expert in everything over time, for sure, and over time I mean over the course of many months and even many years. We can develop expertise in certain areas, and I probably have that in certain areas. And then there are many other things that just pop up for a month or two, and we just have to dive in and do our best. One of the most important, I heard, I want to attribute this probably a former colleague of mine, because I heard her say this first on a panel, Elizabeth. One of the most important skills we have as staff is knowing what questions to ask of what people, right? Asking the experts the questions, the right questions to get the answers we need. And I don't mean answers we need like we're trying to bias their answers, but get the information we need to be able to do our jobs effectively and to understand what information ends up being a little, while interesting maybe, has no direct relevance to our immediate task at hand, and working that all quickly in real time. And again, that's just another skill set we develop over time.
Great. My last question is about, for scientists, engineers, and science enthusiasts who want to engage in policy, what's one piece of advice, didn't come out yet, that you want to leave with our viewers?
I always tell people they should vote. They should vote in every possible election.
Yeah.
The less important the election, the more your vote matters, because often your local election is turned by 1 or 2 votes. And so that's my number one piece. The other thing is, if you really start to get into the policy realm, there's an awful lot of policy that happens via the rulemaking process, and that can be a way that your voice ends up being heard pretty effectively as whatever administration is figures out how to implement the law. But that would require a fair amount of upfront investment in learning, but thoughtful comments to the rulemaking process are taken seriously. So.
We're pretty DC-centric here. We get caught up in our own bubble, but I also like to absolutely vote. I can't say that enough. But I also like to remind people that there are opportunities at the state level and there are opportunities at the local level, even your local school board. So just, think broadly when you think about how do you want to engage in policy, both in terms of what you have the capacity to do because of where you are in your life and where you live and so on, and where you have an opportunity to have influence. And it doesn't have to be here in Washington. It can be on so many different levels in so many different places.
Great. Well, thank you to both of our guests. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks to all of you viewers. Our next webinar is November 15th at 3:30 Eastern Time. To keep track of our upcoming webinars, as well as other events like Science Policy